Well, welcome to Porthcurno, a beautiful Cornish village with one of the best beaches in the country and a surprising place at the heart of the digital revolution. We're standing outside PK Porthcurno, the Museum of Global Communications, and it's here that the first steps were taken on the road to our connected world today. Instant global communication is a phenomenon of the 21st century, but the history of Porthcurno and its place at the centre of this story goes back over 150 years. In the days before telephones, there was only one way to communicate quickly if you weren't face to face, and that was telegraphy. Pulses of electricity sent down a single copper cable could be used to transmit a signal over ever greater distances. By the beginning of the 1800s, a telegraph network was becoming established, meaning people could send important messages across the country faster than ever before. But it was different for international communications. In 1860, it would take 6 weeks to send a secure message from London to India, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. That all changed in 1870, when the first cable was laid connecting Mumbai with Porthcurno, and a message was sent in just 8 minutes. That's an increase of speed of 670,000% at a stroke. A communications revolution was starting.
One of the earliest methods of electrical communication was by Morse Code, invented in the early part of the 19th century, used largely on the railways initially, and then eventually with the laying of submarine cables and so on, nationally and internationally. The first submarine cable was between Britain and France in 1850. Prior to that, there were versions of Morse used on the railways, and one in particular was called the sounder. And I will send the word testing on the sounder, and you will see what it sounds like. There is no continuous tone, it's just the cadence, the clicks of the dots. 2 clicks close together represents a Morse dot, and 2 clicks further apart represents a Morse dash. So visually you have to interpret the cadence of the clicks as to whether the spaces in between them are dots or dashes. But you see, Morse is really the very first binary code. 2 conditions, a dot or dash. The whole alphabet, all the numbers and so on, can be represented by a combination of dots and dashes. Computer code, every letter of the alphabet, when you send an email or whatever, is a combination of dots and dashes, only we don't call them that, we call them noughts and ones, computer code. It's exactly the same thing, but here we're limited to how fast a human wrist can rattle. With computer code, we're up in the gigabit and even terabit range, millions and millions of bits every second. So with Morse code, I could send the whole works of Shakespeare to Australia, if they hadn't got it, in about 3 months. K, I, N, G, King Lear, and so on. Somebody at the other end could write it all down, and they could put on a play. However, it would have taken a very long time to get the information, the data, to the other end of the cable. With modern-day optic fibre cables and high-speed digital communications, the whole of the works of Shakespeare could reach Australia in probably less than 1 second. I'm really not up to speed with the latest technology in terms of the enormous speeds available. But the basic principle remains the same as it was on the railways in the 1840s. However, later on it became possible to receive Morse as an audio tone like this. So now my dots and dashes are literally short and long, dot, dash. So here is the word testing, not in sounder code, but in audio Morse. T-E-S-T-I-N-G. Now, once again, on the early landline systems, cables and so on, the limit was not only the speed at which you could send it, but the speed at which somebody at the other end could receive and interpret it. And again, on the very early cable systems, you didn't receive it even as a sound, sounder or Morse, but as the movement of a flick of light on something called a mirror galvanometer. And we have those here at the museum. And what happened then was the galvanometer was exceedingly sensitive, so it could respond to very, very tiny signals. And on the first long-distance transatlantic cable, and on the early cables from Porthcurno, the receiving instrument was this device that moved a tiny mirror, which created a movement of a spot of light on the screen. So you had to watch the spot of light, and when it went to the left or the right, you would interpret that as dot or dash of Morse code.
Telegraph cables carrying Morse code or cable code connected Porthcurno with places all around the world. As the global network grew, so too did Porthcurno's importance. 14 cables led out from here, carrying messages unseen along the sea floor. And as the network grew, so did the world's reliance on the speed and security of the signals it carried. Whilst in 1868, sending a message to Bombay in a month would have been inconceivable, 10 years later, a break in the cable or a single day's delay would have had serious consequences. The cables and the tools to repair them became vital components in the world of communications.
The first cable landed on the beach of Porthcurno in 1870, and it was known as the Red Sea Line, and it stretched over 5,000 miles, linking Britain with India. Part of the equipment that was used for laying the cable would have been a grapnel, like the one that's next to me. This is a replica. And this grapnel would have been used for hooking the cable from the seabed, carrying out repairs, splicing, and that kind of thing. This was a very important piece of equipment. The completion of the 1870 cable was a landmark piece of technology in terms of global communications, and it was the brainchild of a man called John Pender. When the cable had been completed in June 1870, there was a big soiree, a party at John Pender's house in Piccadilly. There was British royalty and Indian royalty at the event, and John suspended the grapnel that had been used for the laying of the cable above the assembled party. And you can see it in an engraving that was made at the time.
As the physical cables and the means to keep them operational became ever more sophisticated, it was increasingly the human element which was the stumbling block in the quest for faster communications. The signal on a telegraph cable gets weaker proportionally to the square of the distance it's travelled. After about 2,000 miles, it's so weak that no apparatus can decipher it. What you need to do is make sure your cable comes ashore before this happens, so the message can be relayed onwards. In the early days, this was done manually. At a string of relay stations all along the line, telegraphers would wait, listening for signals from far off places. They'd record the messages these signals contained, and then relay them on to the next station along the line. This process could take much longer than it would take the signal to travel the hundreds of miles in between stations. An automated system was desperately needed.
You're now in the tunnels which were built in Porthcurno during the Second World War. This exhibition is the regeneration department, whereby we show how a telegraph message was sent from London to Malta. Regen is the regeneration of a message as it was sent from one place to the next. Because these places are so far away, the signals would be reduced. So regen would then bring the signal level back up to the right level so it could be easily received at the next station down the line. Regen came into being in the 1920s when they had competition from the radio Marconi radio system. They wanted to speed up the transmission of messages, and so they would be able to keep the revenue coming in. And in this tunnel, we have a demonstration to show how a message was sent from London to Malta. And each time the message would travel along its own cable, connected one place to the next. So that we have all these benches set up to show people how the message was relayed from one place to the next to get to its destination. Before this, they were using Morse Code, which they had really equipment to read the dots and the dashes. But because a dash is 3 times as long as a dot, it took quite a long time and a lot of tape to send one letter. But with Regen, they brought in a special code which was called a cable code. This had a positive and a negative difference. The positive was for a dash and the negative was for a dot. And so they would go just one symbol would be for a dash as well. So a dash and a dot were the same length of time. So it was quicker to send a word down region using the cable code than using the Morse code.
By 1930, global communication was a way of life. In the UK, the wireless and cable telegraph operators had been amalgamated to make sure neither was at risk of fatal competition. Britain was communicating with her empire and her allies more frequently and faster than ever before. With the onset of the Second World War, this ability to communicate was both a huge strength and a great vulnerability. Intelligence and data gathering was more sophisticated than ever before. But what use was this information if it couldn't be relayed to the field? The security of the cable network meant that Porthcurno, Britain's biggest and busiest telegraph station, was crucial. But located here on the south coast, just 160 miles from enemy forces, it was at risk of attack.
By the 1930s, Porthcurno was the largest and one of the most important telegraph stations in the world. Tension was rising in Europe, and understandably, staff at the telegraph station in Porthcurno were starting to get nervous about how vulnerable they were. Porthcurno, with its coastal and remote location, was considered to be very vulnerable from attack from the sea or from the air. The large white buildings of the telegraph station were considered very conspicuous. The decision was taken that the telegraph station needed to be moved underground. It wasn't enough to simply paint the buildings with camouflage paint. Permission was given by London that the tunnels would be dug. At that time, there were very few miners left in Cornwall. Most of them had been conscripted to fight in the war. A firm of civic engineers, Nuttall and Company, were commissioned to build the tunnels. They took 9 months in total, and the sum of around £29,000. But in the end, the entire station was moved underground.
PK Porthcurno tells the amazing story of the development of global communications and our role at its heart. But it's more than that. The telegraph companies which built the village in the empty valley, which set up and ran the telegraph station, which trained generations of experts at the engineering college, they made Porthcurno their home. So too did the men and women who lived here, who worked here, and who took the Porthcurno spirit to the furthest reaches of the world. And it's their story which is told in our archive.
The archive is the business archive of Cable and Wireless, and it was originally up in London, but when they actually decided to open the museum down here in Porthcurno, the archive came down to join it. Originally, when the station was set up here in Porthcurno, it started here in 1870, and to begin with you had young men from the UK who would travel down here, be trained, and then basically after they'd finished their training they'd get sent anywhere around the globe, and they didn't have a choice where they went. So it was wherever there was a telegraph station that the company owned, that's where they would go and work, and they'd be moved on after a few years maybe. Some stations they preferred to others, some were very much out the way, like Ascension Island, and then there were other ones like Gibraltar, where there was a little bit more facilities for them and entertainment. So they referred to themselves as the Exiles because they felt very much like going to some of these very remote stations, and of course Porthcurno was one of those because there was nothing else here in the valley at all. So when they came here, they already felt like they'd been exiled from the rest of Britain, and then of course they'd get sent out to any station, and so the term exile kind of like went with them when they went out to all these remote places.
Porthcurno has always been a place apart in West Cornwall. A company village built to house the telegraph station and the people who worked there. The first people to live in the valley in modern times were not the farmers and fishermen of neighbouring villages. Instead, it was the telegraphers and their trainees who were brought in from across the country to run the telegraph station. Before long, people were coming from much further afield to Porthcurno.
It was actually 1950 when the engineering college started here in Porthcurno, and it basically just grew and grew and grew, and people would come here again to be trained from the UK, but then actually they started coming in from places abroad, and they'd be trained up here, and then they'd actually go back to their countries to actually work in telecommunications. So by 1984 there were over 600 students actually here at Porthcurno, and 70% of those were actually from overseas. So it was quite an international community here in Porthcurno, which is quite unusual for Cornwall at that time as well. So it's a very different place to probably anywhere else you would have found in Cornwall at that time. So the training college actually closed in 1993, and that was when it actually moved up to Coventry because they thought that was a bit more of a central area for people to come to the college. But unfortunately for the company, actually that didn't work out, and that college actually closed pretty soon after as well. So when they actually moved the college out of the valley, it just became a completely different place. All those international students who'd been here, all the kind of hub and activity that was going on here just ceased to be, and it kind of went back to just being a very sleepy Cornish valley again after about 100 years of being a very exciting place at the hub of communications. But we do still have fibre optic cables coming into Porthcurno, so there's actually 4 that still come up the beach and through the valley, so the kind of history still continues today. So the museum actually opened in 1998, and the archive came down from London a year later. As it's the business archive of Cable and Wireless, you'll have all the kind of records you expect from a business archive. So you'll have the minute books from board meetings, and this is for telegraph companies going right back to the start of the telegraph. So you're looking at the Eastern Telegraph Company back in from the 1870s onwards, and all the other little telegraph companies that were popping up at that time as well. So you also have anything business related, so you've got also all the financial records as well. You've got all the agreements that were made between the company and also different countries regarding laying cables. We've got all the engineer reports about when each cable was laid, and all the charts that show where all the telegraph cables went as well. But you've also got the personal records, so the staff who actually worked for the various telegraph companies. So we've got the very early staff records going right up to roughly about the 1980s, 1990s. And of course they're very interesting for family history historians. There's also got film in the archive as well. A lot of that is kind of marketing material for the company, and there's films about the college here as well. There's also artwork, so we've got portraits of some of the earliest directors of various telegraph companies, and we've also got a lot of photographs. So we estimated there's about 20,000 photographs in the actual archive. We've just started digitising a lot of them, and they cover all sorts from people's more personal photograph albums, so employees, so it shows them based at various stations around the world and what they saw, and photographs that they sent home basically. But then you've got also the corporate images as well, so where the companies are taking photographs of their stations and branches and just using it to show how well they were doing. So we're now here in the archive, and we're just going to talk through some of the documents and photographs that we have in the archive. So one of the things we have out at the moment is some images from a photograph album that was done by the Eastern Telegraph Company, and basically they went around the world and photographed all their stations that they had. We'll start off with Porthcurno. So this is a photograph of Porthcurno station. Very large white building here. We've got the tennis courts that still exist today, and we've also got the flag of the Eastern Telegraph Company just flying next to the station as well. This was probably the biggest building that was in the valley at that time. So this is Carcavelos station in Portugal. So again, here's a distance shot of the actual building, and again another very imposing building. And this is the station at Suez. So you can see we've got a very large sign above that says Telegraph Office, and you've got some of the telegraph workers standing about outside the station. So here we have the station in Zanzibar, and the actual station, and this was actually when it was being constructed, and then this is it when it was actually finished. And there's more from Zanzibar. We move on from Zanzibar to Delagoa Bay, and again here's the station, and that's been constructed, and that building's actually the kitchen that was used, and there was a farm nearby as well, so that would be where the station would have got their supplies. And then we got some photographs of actual native people. And then we moved to Durban. And again, you'll notice that the architecture at a lot of these stations is very similar, very Western architecture.
From 1870, when the first cable came ashore here, Porthcurno has been a place of innovation and surprise. Our archive, with 150 years of history and stories, might suggest that Porthcurno's day in the sun has passed, that the technologies of today are so far removed from those of the telegraph cables lying on the seabed. It is, it's true, a very connected world. I can stand here in West Cornwall with 5 bars on my phone and be in touch with anyone, anywhere on the planet. And yet, Porthcurno today touches more lives than it ever did at the height of the telegraph station. Most of us communicate wirelessly most of the time, but that word wirelessly only applies for the distance from your device to the nearest mast, router or hotspot. From there, your message goes into the ground where it joins a vast network of fibre optic cables. These cables carry messages as pulses of energy running digitally along a cable, exactly the same as the telegraph cables of the 1870s. There's a perception that most international communication happens by satellite. In fact, 98% of the world's global telecoms is conducted through fibre optic cables. The majority of UK communications goes offshore from Cornish beaches, and about a quarter of that leaves from Porthcurno. So next time you're sending an email to someone in another country, or you're streaming the latest release from Netflix, or you want to post a photo of a gorgeous sunset from your favourite Cornish beach onto Instagram, there's a very real chance that the data containing your message is coming to you via Porthcurno, as messages have been for 150 years.